Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Carrie Browder, and I am the Director of Impact Accountability at Prime Coalition, and also the Director of Project Frame. We're excited that you're here to join us today for our April community meeting. First, we will start off with just updates on what the Project Frame community has been up to, and then we'll get into the meat of our presentation, which is discussions and investor profiles from leaders at Carbon Direct and 2150. We scheduled this for 90 minutes in hopes that we never make it there. So hopefully we'll give some people some found time at the end, but we always like to make sure that we leave room for robust Q&A because we find that that's where a lot of the learning comes from. But thank you again for joining us, and in advance, thank you to our speakers as well. If you're new to Project Frame, just to give you an idea, we are a nonprofit program that is convened by Prime Coalition. We are purpose-built to organize investors around forward-looking emissions impact methodology, reporting, and best practices. We've been exponentially growing since we officially launched a little over a year ago. Investors have been working together on this topic for several years now, but since officially launching Frame, as of December, we have about 600 individual members, or those who have signed up to participate in the content. And that represents around 120 venture capital and private equity firms with 60 billion in capital raised intended for climate and around 200 billion in assets under management. I imagine that number has grown since, but we'll look at it again in June. Some general updates. We have two working groups. One is the content working group, and one is the data and tools working group. Our data and tools working group recently released our first annual survey, which I will go over high level today, and we'll put in the chat for you to review if you'd like to get into the details. We're currently in the process of hosting a tool showcase. We did a call out to the community about who has software tools that investors or impact experts can use to assess forward-looking emissions impact. And we received over 30 inquiries, but in the end selected 6 to be assessed by a group of both the data and tools working group, but also other climate and impact investing experts. We hope to complete that analysis and share a synthesis sometime this summer. And then we are also in the process of continuing to build out the platform, since there were so many that were interested that might not have qualified for our exact definition, but still could be really useful to investors in the future. So if you have any sort of tool that you think helps you either assess forward-looking GHG impact or prove your realized impact, please let us know. There's a link, link in the slides, but we will also make sure it's in the chat. It's just a very short 1-minute type form to suggest a tool that you might know about, and we will follow up hopefully in the coming months. And then the big news, which we'll also get into in the slides, is that our content working group has been working over the past year to build a pre-investment methodology guide, or what we're calling a deep dive. We do plan to release that next week. And so that has been a large effort and lift, and we're really excited to announce it and share it with you all. And then last but not least, we will have a new content working group starting in May. All right, first, I'm going to just give you a high-level overview of the annual survey and some of the things that we took from it that we hope to act upon moving forward. We first wanted to thank the participating firms. This is our first time trying something like this, and we were pleasantly surprised by the interest from the community to get involved and provide feedback. This list does not include those who wished to remain anonymous, but just those who agreed that they wanted to be included. All right, some of the key takeaways. One thing that we expected, but were able to prove, was that our focus is, our membership focus is largely within the US and Europe, We are going to make a concerted effort to try to engage impact investors or climate investors in emerging markets beyond Europe and the US in this coming year. I'm hoping to coax some Asia-based investors to do investor profiles this summer. And we have recently hired at Project Frame specifically staff that we hope will be able to better engage other marketplaces and other time zones. The leading motivation for climate investors is concern for the climate. That's always great to hear. But personally, what I found really interesting is it was closely followed by firm competitiveness. And so I do think that that's something that we'll continue to see grow as this practice continues to evolve. We need further diversification by industry, and that the majority of firms that responded are ones that say they are looking for above market rate returns. And last but not least, that half the respondents, only half report actual or realized emissions impact. This is an area that I think all of us would like to standardize, improve, and grow in the future in a way that is transparent and accountable. So this is just some graphics that you'll see in the annual survey. But these basically cover some of the things that I listed before. One thing that we were proud about was that we asked if the investment practices of the firms aligned with the principles that we put out from Frame earlier this year, and over 90% said yes, even though not all the firms participating in the survey consider themselves members or part of Project Frame. So I think that's encouraging. Another thing that was really surprising was that the majority said that they invest in hardware as opposed to software. We thought it was going to be the opposite. So that's something that we hope to dive more into, and we learn more about through the investor profiles that you'll hear more about today. All right, so next, grand reveal. We're going to give you a preview of our pre-investment methodology guidance, which we will be releasing next week. We will be focused on really helping investors and impact professionals understand the difference between what we call planned and potential impact. So we're focused on forward-looking impact. Some would also associate this with scope 4 or emissions you could avoid in the future. But ultimately, our goal is to enable investors to make smarter climate investments today that will yield even greater climate or GHG mitigation benefits in the future. We will also be discussing things like attribution and additionality. And these are also two topics that we say that we don't have all the answers yet. This is where we were able to reach consensus at this point in time. And we look forward to investigating it further in the future through additional content working groups. I also want to highlight that this was a collaborative effort between over 45 leading investors as well as climate experts. And so getting this group together to come to consensus on anything we think is a huge win. And we really look forward to sharing this and getting your feedback in the future. So as I mentioned, this was the work of our previous content working group, which had around 20 mostly investors in the VC space and private equity space working on this, with a few other climate experts as well. We are now launching a new content working group, which will be starting a new work plan in May. The more or less application process was still a process of 4 or 5 months. We were humbled by the interest in participating, and everyone who is participating has been willing to give of their time. So that I think that really shows the dedication. Our new group will have 35 members from 15 new organizations and a work plan that will be about 14 months. Some of the areas that we plan to discuss are a continuation of the pre-investment methodology. There are things that we really want to dive deeper into, like relative versus absolute baselines, time value of carbon, and how to manage that moving forward. We also have we receive a lot of questions that we haven't been able to really answer from the community over time. So we're going to consider how we could have a more public-facing question board to fill that need, the potential of a methodology course around a lot of the lessons learned that we've developed. And then hopefully we will be breaking into post-investment impact management and reporting actuals. If you'd like to get involved in Frame, there are several ways. One way is the investor profiles that you'll see today. And we also have focus groups, which is a much shorter time commitment, but still gets you involved in the conversation. So if you're interested in that, we'll discuss later how to reach out so we can get you signed up. All right. I am going to just pause quickly for questions on that, and then we will get into the profiles. Does anyone have any questions for me based on what's going on in Project Frame right now? See any raised hands? All right, great. Then with that in mind, I will go ahead and pass it over to Mayank Kapoor. He is the vice president at Carbon Direct Capital, and we're excited to hear about how they use science and relationships to really provide rigor to their vetting process and the success of their investments. So I'll stop sharing my screen now, and Mayank, you can take it away.
Yes, sounds good. And thanks, Carrie, for the introduction. Let me just quickly share, and hopefully this works without hiccup. Okay, hopefully everyone can see this in a second. Okay, good. I'll take that as a yes. Okay, awesome. Okay, so yeah, hi everyone. My name is Mayank Kapoor. As mentioned, I'm a vice president at Carbon Direct Capital. Thanks again to Carrie, and thanks again to kind of the full Frame team. We're proud to be supporters and members of Frame, and really kind of interested and excited by what the kind of organization is working on. And then today, just kind of really want to focus, as Carrie mentioned, on how we think about impact in our broader kind of investment mandate. So maybe quickly on myself, I joined the Carbon Direct Capital team around 2 years ago. I have kind of a finance background, started my career at Morgan Stanley, doing media and telecom investment banking, and then shifted over to TPG Capital, where I was focused on software investing in the buyout group. So honestly, not a climate background, more from a kind of a TMT investment background. But I think, as we all know, that this kind of space needs kind of backgrounds from, or people from all different types of backgrounds and focus areas. So excited for me to kind of be here. Moving into kind of the more important part in terms of Carbon Direct and kind of what we do and how we focus our attention. So maybe taking a step back from Carbon Direct Capital specifically, Carbon Direct overall is an organization focused on decarbonization, and we do that with 2 different businesses. And you'll hear more about the interconnections as I kind of go through the presentation. But we have Carbon Direct Inc., which is our scientific advisory business. Think of that as consulting their clients like the Microsofts, Shopify's, kind of Fortune 100, 200 companies of the world with advice on projects or, specific types of reviews or just kind of broader decarbonization plans. And then we have our side of the business, which is Carbon Direct Capital, which we're focused on today. We're a growth equity investor focused on kind of helping companies go from that early technology stage into kind of the inflection to commercialization. I think that's importantly why we're kind of focused our efforts more on that growth equity phase of a company rather than kind of the VC phase. So just a bit of difference in our kind of focus areas, our staging. As kind of previewed, we view ourselves as science-first investors. So the kind of interlacing between our commercial and kind of capital underwriting with technical underwriting as well is very important. And we'll spend quite a bit of time talking through how we think about that and how we apply that. But the scientists are really there from before we start diligence, into diligence, and post investment as well. And then other topics just wanted to kind of get into around 1, how the scientists work with us, and then 2, importantly, our kind of annual impact reporting and how we go around about that process. So moving into So as kind of mentioned, in terms of our investment philosophy, it really is kind of core thesis revolving around science and growth equity investing. And as Carrie kind of previewed, still really focused on, making outsized returns, but doing so in a obviously responsible and impactful way. I think one thing to note is that we don't have set CO2 kind of emission goals per se. So I know some investors kind of focus on specific metrics to hit. We're kind of more focused on underwriting that technology, both from a kind of technical, functionality perspective, but also from an impact perspective. So it's not as kind of targeted of a mission, but as we'll talk about, definitely kind of tracking against our emission profile. And as kind of mentioned, we're focused on helping companies through their growth stage into kind of that commercialization inflection point. And also note, just as a kind of taking a step back, we're obviously focused on investing in impactful companies, but then as a company ourselves, between our Inc. side and our capital side, we're also, just as a note, purchasing carbon removals to offset all of our own emissions. So trying to also practice what we preach in some ways. At a high level, kind of investment vehicles, where a fund-based investor is deploying 10-year funds. Our first fund is fully deployed, and you kind of see the 8 names across that fund on the page here. And then the second fund is what we're currently investing out of. We're 4 investments into this one, but this is only about a 1 year, kind of 16 months into this fund right now. So obviously, kind of a lot of upside to go. And importantly, to note that our investment philosophy, both commercially and kind of technically impactfully, has remained the same between funds 1 and 2. And then also highlighting even our focus areas of investment have remained consistent between the 2 funds as well. So at a high level, and I guess I didn't mention this as much upfront, but we're not kind of broad climate investors. We are very, very focused on carbon management and carbon management technologies. And this is kind of the way we lay out that universe for our investment mandate. So just kind of going through these, and I'll give brief overviews, but happy to dive into any later. But carbon capture, so this would be on the point source capture side, kind of industrial. I don't know if I just muted myself, but
yes, you're back. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So carbon capture on the point source side, carbon removal, similar, but now on kind of the full removal side. So there can be DAC technologies, mineralization, like heirloom, biomass related, like clean energy systems. CO2 utilization is our largest bucket in terms of focus area and kind of capital deployed. So this is any sort of utilization into fuels, chemicals, cement, concrete, steel. So kind of pretty relatively broad universe of investments here. And you can kind of see some illustrative logos, and then hydrogen. So really focused across the rainbow of hydrogen on kind of clean hydrogen production. And just to note, these kind of approximate allocations at the bottom are based on capital deployed till date, and overall kind of mirror our kind of investment targets for investing behind each of these categories. Okay, and then kind of on to more of the investment strategy. So as mentioned, and I'll want to spend some time here just kind of talking through how we go through our diligence, and then also how we interlace the science with that. So as mentioned, our scientists and the science team are involved from the beginning. So typically for us, we call our triage process of a deal comes in the door. And then we kind of go through a couple different layers of scrutiny and diligence to get it from, prospect to do some work on it, to do a lot of work on it, to hopefully then invest. And each one of those kind of stages have a pretty large funneling effect. Focus on kind of the science staging. The scientists are core to our time management, honestly, from an investment perspective, because just with the kind of pace and the quantity of deals in the market, it's helpful for us to really be able to focus our attention on specific companies and opportunities. And the scientists are helping us along with, kind of general commercial screens to ensure that we're using our time in the best way possible. So maybe even just from a, what is the screen that the scientists are using? I don't want to call out any specific companies or industries, but at a high level, they're really helping us vet, on an initial look into a company, what is their technology and what is their kind of belief in, will it scale? Are they at the tech readiness or the TRL level they claim they are? How do they feel about that general kind of category of company and kind of what's been happening with companies in that space in the past. So again, not with naming any names, but they're really kind of vetting that initial look at, is this something interesting enough for us to continue looking at or not? And a vast majority of deals that we look at kind of do not make that first screen, either for science reasons, commercial reasons, maybe just be too early for us or too small of a check for us. So there are multiple screens there, but really want to highlight that the scientists are involved upfront in that initial gating discussion. And then from there, if we go into full diligence on a deal, once again, the scientists are central to that. So of course, like any other kind of a growth equity investor, will have our kind of commercial underwriting and kind of all the discussion that goes on the commercial side. But importantly, we basically have an in-house tech consultancy through the CD Inc. team. So on any deal, we'll bring across 1 to 3, PhDs with expertise in that area, and they will be the ones leading our tech diligence. So that goes from, pouring through testing data, going over scaling plans, understanding IP, all the whole gambit of really understanding the technology at a very deep level. And kind of that helps us obviously focus our attention in terms of our investment underwriting time. And also kind of helps us of those gating decisions of to proceed or not to proceed, or to invest or not to invest. So that kind of brings us all the way into kind of the investment decision, which the capital team is making. And then even post-investment, really, again, want to highlight that the science kind of relationship doesn't end just at investment. They are a resource for our portfolio companies for whatever they need, whether it's kind of high-level advice, general check-ins, if they have a policy question, if they have a new product line question, and we can kind of go through some examples, but they are fully available as another kind of resource. And I think there's also a bit of a kind of stamp to the market as well of a Carbon Direct investment, was fully vetted by our technical team. And as a part of that as well, they're creating kind of very detailed tech reports to kind of summarize their findings, which I know our team, our investors, and also the company find very helpful to really summarize all those key learnings. So a lot of great synthesis that goes into our ultimate investment. Maybe kind of one specific kind of call out of an example in terms of post-investment assistance. So, 2 of our portfolio companies are Lilac, which is focused on capture at kind of the cement lime plant level. So they're using an indirect kiln heating mechanism. And then Heirloom, which is an accelerated mineralization company. So without us interfering too much, there basically was a partnership recently announced between these 2 companies. And high level, we allowed them to kind of work out the commercial side and the commercial benefits of that partnership themselves. But it's important to also note that the assistance that we provided, just from a kind of technical perspective, and really helping them understand the fit between the companies, and kind of the benefit now is that Heirloom being able to use Lilac's technology, as mentioned, obviously is a commercially success for both companies, but importantly will help reduce the emissions of Heirlooms during their removal advanced mineralization process. So it is kind of a win-win situation of 2 companies getting that commercial benefit, but also importantly being a very kind of tangible impact benefit as well. So that's just kind of one of multiple examples. I think also I'll note maybe here as well on the kind of actually, sorry, I can preview this later when we talk about the impact reports. So this is more kind of the investment side of it. In terms of, I'll kind of gloss over this slide. This kind of just runs through other high-level topics we focus on. I think this won't be foreign to really anyone on the call. Obviously, we're doing kind of business, commercial, financial underwriting as well. And here as well, just kind of laying out those layers in a bit more detail. But once again, focusing on that kind of tech and IP layer. I think one point that I've also kind of glossed over a bit is, it's not just PhDs with subject matter expertise in cement or mineralization, for example. It's I think what sets us apart is it's that layer of the subject matter expertise, along with policy experts, so ex-DOE or kind of even kind of other international policy experts on the team. There are kind of project management experts on the team who have worked on building large infrastructure projects in the past. There are former engineers who have worked at ONGs or large industrial complexes. So it goes beyond just specific kind of PhD level knowledge on one topic. And it really is a very holistic review of all aspects of what a company has to kind of navigate to go from, lab stage to actual kind of full commercial stage. And also one other thing that I'll also preview later is there's also now a new tangent on environmental justice and climate justice as well. So it's not just kind of a core focus on technical impact and CO2 impact. We can talk about this a bit more, but there's also now a focus on broader impact. And what does that mean in terms of kind of the justice, environmental justice aspect of this as well? So we now have a head of environmental justice who's kind of helping us lead those reviews. And then just focus here, maybe just now is a good time to kind of talk about our impact report and how we approach that. So overall, we're basically going out to our portfolio companies and at the core kind of collecting data on their CO2 impact. And that goes across what we measure as tons utilized, tons avoided, tons captured, and tons removed. So those are kind of the four big categories. And obviously, each one of our portfolio companies, based on their business, will be kind of different across those buckets. But those are what we're asking for our customers. And then where our scientists come in is that when we get that data back, our scientists are really vetting that especially on the on the avoided part, because at a high level, you're using a carbon intensity score for your product versus kind of call it the gray or conventional product. So it's important for us to also have our own lens of that kind of full cradle to grave LCA underwriting of what we believe there or what we can kind of underwrite there. So there's also kind of that scientific help on the impact reporting side. And then all of that kind of comes in with one kind of package impact report across our portfolio. And that's what gets presented to kind of RLPs internally. So that is like a really important kind of end of year impact tracking mechanism for us that we kind of are obviously focused on. And as a part of that as well, we do kind of help our companies lay out or understand their long-term targets as well. So whether it's a 2030, 2040, but all of our portfolio companies also have a set kind of target for their impact goals in the next kind of medium term, call it. I think also, from a board perspective, with some of our investments, we can be either on the board or we can be board observers as well. I think this is also where a lot of our kind of strategic and technical assistance comes in. So even some informal questions around policy or, hey, we want to apply for XYZ grant. Can you guys help us check our application or write our application? So there's a lot more layers of where our kind of impact assistance can come in. And I think this is helpful because we haven't so far, knock on wood, run into impact issues because I think we're kind of ingrained in the process with our portcos from investment on. So there really is that tracking that's happening real time versus, oh shoot, we're trying to think about this and, can you scramble and help us? So I think that live interaction has been very beneficial, both for us, but also for our companies. And maybe kind of ending with, where we're looking going forward. I think, I laid out kind of where we're focused our attention on the tracking side and how what metrics we're focused on tracking from an impact perspective. At the end of the day, this is also a kind of a young industry. So I think, as with everyone else, we're also trying to refine how best to stay on top of impact reporting and really define what are the best impact metrics. So, we laid out what we track today, but that doesn't mean that we can't improve or change that system going forward. And I think also we just want to call out as well, kind of that point about broader impact as well. So it's not just necessarily CO2 or GHG emission impact. I think we're also trying to help focus the market more broadly on broader impact topics like environmental justice, equality, things like that. So maybe this is a good time for me to pause and see if there's any questions.
Thank you so much. If you stop sharing, we'll put up
Yes.
the other slide, just reminding everyone to please use the raise hand function, or you can use the chat or message me directly. Thank you so much, Mayank. That was really interesting. One of the questions that popped up for me is sort of if you could further explain sort of your relationship with Carbon Direct Inc. And I would love for you to say, sort of define for us, when you say policy, do you mean like governance of the company or policy like advocacy more broadly, like the regulatory framework, and how you get involved in that with the companies that you work with? Be great.
Yeah, no, for sure. Maybe tackling the second question first. So yeah, I guess in this case, when I was saying policy, I meant more so on the kind of government relations. Of course, we can help in internal governance and governance as well, but I think that falls a bit more into kind of our capital team's responsibility, versus I think the policy aspect is obviously more in the expertise wheelhouse of some of our scientists. And that honestly is becoming increasingly important because with the passage of IRA and other legislation in the US, along with a lot of kind of talks of other legislation across the world, the policy angle is honestly pretty new, and a lot of companies are really trying to understand not just the high level benefits of 45V or Q or X or whatever letter you want to throw out there, but also importantly, like where can they fit into that? And there's a lot of these grant applications that maybe companies don't know about. So I think it's a level of awareness that one, they're helping them get aware of what's available to them. And then two, they're helping our scientists are helping companies kind of execute across whether it's applications, even whether it's applying or making sure that certain credits can be applied, or just kind of talking directly with DOE members to ensure that, hey, our pathway is 1% different than what's in the legislation. Can we make sure that this is included as well? So a lot of different layers of policy assistance there. And then, yeah, I guess more in terms of kind of our day-to-day interactions with the kind of science team as well. I think kind of the biggest benefit for us is just having them, within our sister organization of CD Inc. So, of course, we have kind of the firewalls in place, then proper compliance to make sure that we're not fully sharing information across the wall. But at the same time, it is a very nice kind of informal relationship with them of working pretty hand in hand and kind of slacking questions and answers back and forth. And so it's a very organic relationship in terms of, the scientists obviously have their expertise in that area, but it's, us helping them really frame those questions and topics of, what kind of applies to our actual investment thesis. And so being a bit more kind of focused on the review. And then also at the end of the day, it's important to also note that any investment decisions are, within the capital team. So, we're using our scientists as a really great and helpful and valuable resource on the technical diligence side. But importantly to note that, the end decision still kind of comes down to a commercial carbon direct capital decision-making apparatus.
Wonderful, thank you. We do have a question in the chat, and I've received a couple more personally. Could you speak a little bit more about your decision not to set GHG targets?
Yeah, I think, and honestly, this is one of those things that could adapt, right, with the market. So I think, when we started up Carbon Direct Capital about 3 years ago, it kind of was that same point of it. It's an early market, and there's kind of a lot of moving pieces here. So I think now that we're into our second fund, and as we kind of continue to kind of honestly just learn more and kind of adapt our own kind of processes more, I can't preclude that there won't be targets in the future. But I think for us, it was more helpful at this stage of the market, the kind of investment landscape, and our fund to be more focused holistically on impact almost on a case-by-case basis across our companies, rather than kind of anchoring ourselves to like a set target point. Because again, I think different companies can have different potential for impact in multiple ways. And maybe there's impact today that's smaller, but as they scale, that impact scales exponentially as well. So I think it's giving us a bit of that breathing room to kind of tailor our decisions on impact for each company and each investment decision, rather than having like a kind of prescriptive view that may not fit every company the same way.
Thank you. There's a question here about environmental justice. I'm going to expand it to sort of include some of the other questions I've received. Could you talk a little bit more about the qualitative metrics that you're trying to engage in, specifically also what you're doing around environmental justice? I think a lot of investors are grappling with that, so it'd be great to hear where your thinking is on those metrics that go beyond just GHG.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's an exciting topic for us as well, because, we're new to this space as well. It's great bringing in Christian, who's our head of EJ, to really help us frame how to think about this. So maybe I can give some examples of, if we're looking into a project, for example. So, if we're investing into a company that has a layer of technology that then gets sold or utilized or licensed to specific projects that are creating fuels or chemicals or what have you. I think the one side of it that people overlook at times is if you're building a, billion-dollar project in XYZ municipality, everyone thinks about the economics of the project and the returns and the transportation away from it. but no one really thinks about the local layer of, how did you engage with the local populace? Did you speak with actual residents? Did you speak with the people there? What are the wages of jobs that could be offered, and how's that compare to what's kind of in the area today? Kind of what are the general benefits to the community, and how does that weigh against any potential environmental or community kind of drawbacks as well? So it's kind of that. It's one layer of it is just having those conversations with some of these local communities, and then at a high level as well, just thinking through, there's actually this kind of high level scale, and I'm not sure if we published this yet, or maybe we're in the process of one day publishing it, but there's a scale we look at of, how in depth is your community engagement, and it goes all the way from didn't really think about it, which unfortunately a lot of companies are kind of near this stage, to like heavily engage with the community and heavily engage with discussions with local community leaders and population. So we tried now to place our investments kind of on that scale, and then hopefully with time be able to help push our companies towards the better edge of that scale. So it's an evolving process, but one that we're kind of evolving live with our head of EJ now.
Awesome, thank you. Do you all factor in a frame, everyone seems to have a different definition of the word additionality. So I'm actually going to step away from that and say your contribution. Is your investor contribution at all a factor in your vetting process or your decision to invest in a company?
And sorry, just explain maybe quickly what
it's sort of what you could potentially claim as your impact for your investment down the road. We'll go into it in our paper that we release next week, but it's a very complex topic, a lot of different opinions on it. So no pressure to have the right answer.
No, it's a good prompt, and this is exactly why we're happy members of Project Frame to learn along with everyone here. But no, I think right now we're looking again kind of on the investments on a investment by investment basis based on their impact they can have, but not necessarily tied to what we can report against or how that impacts our own reporting. It very much is a view of the company's own ability to have an impact on the world, not necessarily just us as investors.
Great, thank you for sharing. And then sort of back to the qualitative metrics a bit. Are you finding that companies already have some sustainability or equity data on hand? And have you experienced any roadblocks, and how do you get companies there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's kind of a bit different based on the sustainability side, or kind of the CO2 or GHG impact side. Typically, there is some layer of data. To be honest, there's usually some layer of cleanup that's required as well, or just like really sifting through it. And I think that's exactly where our science help is coming in as well. So typically on the sustainability data side, you'll see some data that we're trying to help vet with them. I think a bit on the community engagement or kind of broader ESG metrics, it's a bit varied by company. And again, that's where we're trying to also step in and be helpful to our companies of, helping them through that process, understanding, even as simply as sending them, requests, and then as they see the questions, they'll kind of figure out what they have to answer. So it's sometimes as simple as kind of pushing them in just through a request. But yeah, it's almost a bit of a two different tracks right now.
All right, thank you. Were there any other remarks you would like to add? There was one question I think is more a general frame question in the chat that I'd like to answer, but if you have any final. Oh, all right, no worries. Thank you so much for presenting. We really appreciate it. I also want to give a shout out to Justine in the chat, who's also been answering questions on behalf of Carbon Direct. There was a question in the chat about using two different investors using one company, or co-investing in a company, but both using Frame. Would they get a different output from their analysis? I would say it depends on the data that they're using for setting their baselines and what data they're using for projecting, as far as if you had a business, if you're doing planned or potential impact. So we'll get into that a little bit more in Peter's presentation as well in our methodology deep dive that we're releasing next week. But I would say if they were working completely independently, they would probably have two different answers based on the data they were collecting and using. Hopefully, if you have a common methodology, though, that gives you an excuse to get together as a group of investors to say, like, what are the assumptions you're using? Do we have the same assumptions? Like, let's discuss this further, so we're on I guess, on the same page if we choose to invest in a company and monitor their impact together moving forward. But I really like that question, and I hope that's something that we're going to dive deeper into in the next group. I see a raised hand. Oyen?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I wanted to ask, one of your first slide mentioned an impact assessment committee. I wanted to ask, is that purely internal, and how does it work? What sort of things do you discuss, and what is the kind of governance structure around that?
Yeah, good question. It's a kind of cross-collaboratory committee of members of Carbon Direct Capital and also members of Carbon Direct Inc. So it's kind of the full gambit of our team. And one layer of it is on the data collection side, just for our portfolio companies to get the data we mentioned. But then to your point, there's also that layer of using the scientific help to sift through that, and then also deciding what, how, and what to present. So it really is kind of the full cross collaboration of members of capital who are focused on the data, members of the science team who are focused on policy, our head of EJ, members who are focused more on kind of so just the whole gambit of ensuring that our impact reports, both this year, but importantly as we scale and year over year, continue to get refined, and we're focusing on the correct areas, call it.
Thank you.
All right, wonderful. We will now transition to our next speaker, Peter from 2150. Peter is the head of sustainability at 2150, based in the UK. As Peter will get into in his presentation, they're a little bit unique in that they're heavily focused on urban climate investments. Thank you so much for joining us today, Peter. Please take it away.
Great. Yeah. And thank you so much for allowing us to have this forum to share what we're doing at 2150. Let me get my screen shared. One second. There it is. All right. Can everyone see that? Perfect. Okay, cool. So I'm Peter. I'm with a venture capital fund called 2150. Based in London, but the fund is based between London and Copenhagen. So maybe a little unique within the venture space. My background initially was in international development. I was at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development on their climate change team, working on investments for large municipalities and then also large industrial players, so like factories, doing project finance. And then have recently moved into venture capital in just about a year and a half ago with 2150 to lead up our work, also focused on cities and industries. So it's a bit of a good fit. But I don't really have sort of a investment background. I more come from a climate science and environmental science background. I've always sort of seen myself as the climate nerd sitting next to the investment professionals. And I think that sort of thinking hopefully will help you understand how we approach investments at 2150 and how sustainability is really just ingrained very much in our due diligence, the same way you would have robust financial due diligence. So quickly, I'll just go over this. The fund, and this is sort of the main fundamentals. So we have an initial fund that closed in Q3 of 2021. The fund size is 268 million. Right now we have 15 portfolio companies, which I'll get into in a little bit. But we are an earlier stage investor than Carbon Direct. We focus on seed to Series B, with Series A really being our sweet spot. And then importantly, we're an Article 9 fund under the EU's SFDR, which means everything we invest in has to have demonstrable impact. And specifically for us, means everything we invest in has to have demonstrable environmental impact. And then the structure of our fund is quite typical for a VC fund. Going into some more details, won't read through all of this, but I think that a couple of things to pull out here is that in terms of how we approach like the sectors and where we invest, as Carrie mentioned, we're an urban focused fund. So we focus on urban tech, and I'll describe what that means in a little bit. But those sectors can really run a huge gambit, but a particular focus of us is on buildings and industry. And then we also have the opportunity to invest in energy, transport, carbon management, climate resilience, and biodiversity. I think importantly there, what you can see is that this is more than just climate mitigation. This is getting into factors such as climate adaptation, biodiversity, circular economy, et cetera. And then in terms of impact assessments, over on the right, sort of the time horizon of assessment, We work with all of our portfolio companies, both before and after investment, to develop at least projections out to 2030. And I'll get into that in terms of how we develop it, but that is very core to sort of how we look at the full scope of what we're eventually going to be investing in for a company. Now, the fund, as I said, we're based between London and Copenhagen, but we invest globally. So here you can see the portfolio companies as of today. Actually, one of them was just announced, Home Tree here in the UK, which is helping to drive home decarbonization. Without going into each and every single one of these, I think what's important to note is that we invest between hardware and software. We invest in companies like Biomason in the bottom left, which is helping to revolutionize how we make cement, getting rid of the cement kilns. Blue Frontier right next to it, which is hyper efficient air conditioning. But then we also invest in more software plays. So Open Solar, you can see the line down in Australia, is a online platform to facilitate the uptake of rooftop PV and help get people who are not installing it before readily trained and up and running to be installing it in the future. So the portfolio then is sort of split between this hardware software play. Now, getting into cities and why 2150 focuses on this. So we view cities through this lens, what's called the urban stack, which are these 4 layers of that are interconnected, that each speak to sort of the individual experience and then sort of the collective impact that cities have. So at the bottom, there's the enabling part of cities. And this is sort of the things that help us maybe transition towards a new paradigm towards sustainability. So it's things like frontier materials, which is new types of cement, intelligent infrastructure. Build is the sort of most traditional idea of what you would think is urban tech. So this is the actual physical work. So the concrete and steel, construction planning, and new construction methods like modular construction. Operate is sort of the energy systems of buildings, or how things communicate between each other. So this includes mobility and logistics and sort of movement of goods. And last is on experience, which would be what you and I sort of experience just walking around the streets every day. So this is things like biodiversity, air pollution, and ultimately trying to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Now, when we look at where cities sort of fit within the climate picture, they really are a driver of climate change, and also we see as sort of engines of growth when it comes to scaling up the solutions that we need to reach net zero and create more resilient spaces. So right now, as of today, cities account for 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions, 75% of final energy consumption. More than half the population lives in cities, and this is going to increase to more than 2/3 by 2050. Yet cities only take up 1.5 or just about 1.5% of global land area. That's going to increase by about 50% in the coming 30 years. But again, their small footprint is actually outsized when you look at it in terms of their contribution to climate change. Then also, when you think about where things are moving to 2050, we're looking at potentially 50% of the urban population being exposed to extreme heat by 2050, and 1/3 of major cities may exhaust their current water resources. So essentially, if we're going to solve climate change, cities are going to be the sort of main conduit for it. So we're trying to, at 2150, find those urban sustainability challenges and then solutions that will help to drive the sustainable transformation of our urban spaces. And how this manifests in terms of what we look in terms of our investments, we have these 4 impact principles that run between environmental concerns and then wider sort of social and economic concerns. We layer this on top of our regulatory requirements as being an Article 9 fund. So quickly, just as an Article 9 fund, as I said, everything we invest in has to have an demonstrable environmental impact. But we've structured the fund so it can go a little bit beyond just climate mitigation, so just reduction or removal of emissions, and have given ourselves the flexibility to invest in other environmental concerns as a primary outcome, such as adaptation and biodiversity, which we've actually been able to do so far. But then more importantly, and in some ways, the impact principles that we actually drive for in our investments then speak to sort of this wider picture of sustainability, where climate action being mitigation and adaptation is ultimately either reduction of emissions or increased resilience. Resource efficiency and environmental protection is really sort of self-explanatory, but has that biodiversity piece under it. Then, while those are our primary outcomes, is sort of we're obliged to have those as the things that we can point to for each of the investments, there are co-benefits that we're seeking to maximize as well, being in social resilience and balance. So this is looking at things like affordability, and ensuring safe and healthy and livable cities. And then profit and purpose, essentially looking for those win-wins where the economic model or business model of a company is going to help to potentially create economic betterment for users as well. Now, the 2150 approach to investment, we do three main stages. And I really appreciated Carbon Direct's presentation on this, because I think that there's a lot of overlap in how we do sort of the early investment side of things. And we do these things called deep dives, which are really, really intense research into a specific urban sustainability challenge that we've identified to figure out exactly what's driving the impact there and where we're going to be able to enter. And I'll give some examples of what those look like in a second. And so from that deep dive research, then we sort of have a thesis for where we think we're going to enter into a sector and into a market, including like the most exciting companies to us. And then we have a sort of more typical venture capital role in investment, making sure that there is additionality in our capital, particularly if we're going to help them scale solutions or find the right clients to be able to pilot some of their work, as we're coming in at quite an early stage, sort of the scale up stage. And last is on this ecosystem value add, which is working closely with our portfolio companies to build impact insights, and then also connecting them with our strategic LPs, portfolio companies, and sort of wider network that we've built to help them make those right connections and scale up. Now, on the deep dive research, as I mentioned, we develop these insights, which we also share with our investors, into topics that we think are sort of core urban sustainability challenges. So these historically have been in things like, as you can see, cement and concrete, cooling, windows, steel, and you can see their gigaton contributions in terms of current emissions in each of those sectors. And so we try to understand what those challenges are, understand the sources of impact in those areas, try to map the sustainable development pathway in each of those sectors. So what's the transition to 2050 going to look like, for example, in each of those areas? And then is there the potential for venture capital to actually come in and accelerate that timeline or to help develop that technology that might be at a really low TRL readiness? And last, we identified then the potentially exciting companies for us to get in touch with, having done that research. This then gets into our investment strategy, which follows four main steps, being sort of the screening, which involves our investment minimum criteria. I'll get into that in the next slide. Then we do a deep review of the companies, which includes the impact analysis and impact modeling. Last, we get into an agreement, which in our term sheets, we oblige all of our companies to commit to monitoring their greenhouse gas emissions, have a net zero target that they're building towards, and start to build in the appropriate governance mechanisms to look at their climate risks and wider ESG concerns. And then from a value add perspective, we do a lot of hands-on work with the companies afterwards to really build impact insights into their management discussions and into their board discussions, so that we have as clear of a picture of if they're delivering on impact as if they're delivering on revenue. So in terms of minimum investment criteria, there are three things that we look at as sort of the knockout criteria for investments. The first is, does the company align with the Paris Agreement? Meaning, does it support a low carbon pathway in its relevant sector and enhance or preserve resilience to climate change? The second is, does it support one of the 6 objectives of the EU taxonomy, one of the 6 environmental objectives, I should say, of the EU taxonomy, and it needs to be a significant contribution that includes concerns about do no significant harm. And third is that it needs to be free of fossil fuel revenues. And so this is sort of taking what's the Paris alignment criteria under the EU SFDR regulation into a bit of a sort of extreme stance, where they cannot derive any revenues from the extraction, refinement, transport, sale, or trade of fossil fuels or high emissions electricity. They essentially just cannot be involved in it whatsoever. Now, zooming in quickly on that Paris alignment discussion, there are 3 main questions that we ask. First is, does a company support a low carbon pathway for the relevant sector? So this is often developed by the IEA, sometimes WBCSD, sometimes the MDBs develop this, or even industry organizations develop them independently. It essentially says, how aggressive do we think that we can get to in 2050 in terms of our decarbonization pathway? And our company needs to say that they either accelerate that pathway, ensure that pathway happens, or do not prevent it from happening if they're going after things like adaptation or biodiversity, for example. The second is, does the company or its product risk carbon lock-in? This could be from the continued use of fossil fuels, for example, and then obviously they'd be knocked out if we think that it's going to continue the use of emissions-intensive practices beyond what we think is really a responsible timeline. And third is, does the company or its activities undermine climate resilience in the context in which it operates? Maybe it's a really water-intensive process, for example, and this is something that we need to closely consider, particularly on a geographic scale. Now, this then sort of the first part of this being these minimum criteria then gets built into a larger 5-step process. So the first part here being the Paris alignment and SFDR, those were those minimum investment criteria that we run through in all investments. After they get past that sort of initial gate, then we start to look into what do we do with the companies to make sure that they really align with our wider objectives, those impact principles that I mentioned to you. And so here we look at mission and impact modeling. And so this is sort of the more traditional work that Project Frame is talking about, looking at what's the company's contributions to their specific objective going to be, often measured in greenhouse gas emissions. Then we look at the company itself, like looking at its business model, its growth plan, if the team is really committed to sustainability. On a wider policy level, we try to understand their readiness, particularly for the environment that they're going to be growing into. And then also ESG standards and minimum safeguards that we are obliged as an Article 9 fund to meet with all of our investments. And last is on deal structure, on that term sheet side of things, making sure that they are okay with everything that we put as standard in all of our term sheets. This is really something that we want all of our companies to sign up to. Getting into the impact side of things, there is this discussion, Carrie just mentioned, between planned and potential impact. At 2150, we definitely lean more on the planned impact approach, but are informed by the potential impact evaluation. And what that means is, so those deep dives that I mentioned to you, let's say, for example, in cement and concrete, we understand that's a 2.5 gigaton problem, right? And that's something that we, if we're going to be addressing it, have a company that's going to go in to be able to address what's really a major source of emissions in the world. So that's sort of the potential side. But we know a company is not going to reach 50% market share or 100% market share of cement production. So that's when we fall back on this planned impact approach. And what we do with the companies is we build an assessment of essentially how big the company thinks it can be by 2030, at least, and ideally 10 years. And so this is building off of their financial model, where if they say that they're going to have X sales in 2030 or beyond, we translate those sales into a relevant impact metric. And what this requires us to do is have a really, really robust understanding of the product level impacts of each of the companies in which we invest. So, for example, the cement company, we need to know at an early stage, pre-investment, with the best science that's available, essentially, what's the global warming potential of that product? How is it developed? How does it compare to the baseline conditions of cement production today? What's the potential outlook for how it's going to be maybe even decreasing its emissions profile in the future? And we can model that out using the sort of revenue and sales data that we would get as a typical financial model, and then link it to impact. Now, considering impacts beyond greenhouse gas emissions, which we have a couple of companies where we've developed this as well, this has been a more sort of bespoke approach based off of what we think the company is able to track and sort of what speaks to its contributions to the challenges that it's identifying. But on a portfolio approach, the ideal, and this is what we're starting to get some data points, but not ubiquitously, is on the ability to collect information like energy savings, material savings, water pollution savings. This has really been when and where it's been available. Now, as an example of sort of how this impact modeling gets built out, as I said, we developed a product level impact understanding with the available company and research data. And often this is third-party verified. Actually, for the most part, it's been third-party verified. And so what we do then with these companies is take those, for example, maybe like a NYSERDA study, an NREL study, peer-reviewed research that they've been able to develop, All of this is sort of gets into our idea of what is the unit level impact of their product. We link that impact growth to the company growth through revenues and sales, as I mentioned. And that impact modeling data then gets built out to this model to 2030. We develop this both before a company it comes into the 2150 portfolio, as well as after they come into investment, as we get more and more information that's coming in to be able to sort of develop better insights. What we try to do then is get them to adopt these impact metrics and targets into their standard board reporting, into their management discussions, the same way that they would adopt a revenue model. So when we look at this from a sort of more specific lens, we have a company called Luxwall, which we just invested in. Luxwall is hyper efficient windows. So really as energy efficient as triple pane argon windows, if not more. It's called vacuum insulated glass. They're based in Ypsilanti, Michigan. What's really exciting about them is that they're both available for new build construction and retrofit construction. So going into the investment, we knew these two data points of 3.24 kilograms of CO2 per square foot reduced per year if it's replacing a single pane window. Then we have 2 kilograms of CO2 reduced per square foot if it's replacing a double pane window. That's based off of, again, third-party developed research that looked at the laboratory conditions and testing of their facility. But right now, this company is getting their first major production factory off the line. So today, this is on the right, we built that model with this initial understanding of sort of these coarse, but still scientifically backed impact metrics for sort of how the company might be able to grow to 2030. What we're doing now, though, is developing more field testing and EPD with the company, as well as getting more subcategories for replacement of not just single pane or double pane, but also commercial, residential, the specific application. So we can have a much more robust impact model and also a sales model of what the company is going to do. And then we're going to build that out with them as we get this information in to then have a model for impact to 2030, if not further, for how they're going to be then disseminating and their product and ultimately driving impact through that dissemination. Now, last couple of things to mention is our impact reporting. So annually, we conduct an impact assessment of how essentially our portfolio companies are doing. The main data collection is between January and March. So just wrapped up. We're writing the impact report right now. And we collect 4 major things. The first is on positive impacts, essentially have they actually delivered based off of their activity data. The second is on operational impacts. So we work with all of our portfolio companies to develop a full scope 1 through 3 greenhouse gas inventory. We use one of our portfolio companies, Normative, to help develop this insight. So there's a standardized greenhouse gas protocol compliant calculation that we have for the entire portfolio. Then we look at policies and governance, essentially how well they're doing at adopting net zero targets, putting those plans into place, wider ESG concerns. And we also sort of on the ESG front, look at employment and diversity statistics. The impact report for this year should be coming out 3rd week of May. And there's definitely a lot of fun information in there beyond just sort of this impact side and sort of how 2150 is thinking about ourselves in a wider sustainability ecosystem that we're looking forward to share. That's the whole bit for how we're doing. I know it's I think a lot of content, but hoping that we can have a few questions to get into sort of how this works maybe in practice and maybe give you a few more examples. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was fantastic. I know some people don't stay for the whole time, so I want to give a quick virtual round of applause to both of our speakers and thank them so much before we get into the Q&A. And so just a quick reminder that we will be using the raise hand function or the chat. Then we'll probably be able to let people go a little bit early for some found time. So that's great. But before that, let's jump into some questions for Peter. Peter, thank you for the really rich discussion and diving into the examples. I was wondering, you mentioned using third-party verification a couple of times. This comes up a lot in the Project Frame community. I was just wondering, at what point do you engage a third-party verifier, and ultimately who pays for it? Is it the company that pays for the third-party verification, or is that something that your firm subsidizes?
It's a really good question. So I think my answer is really based off the fact that we're coming in sort of seed Series A. So that means there's a certain like level of information that we expect the companies to have. So we're sort of the investor that comes in when the company's about to really scale up, like really get their production to a larger level. And because of that, then there's not really technology risk that we're taking on as much. And it's more about sort of like go-to-market strategies and sort of like production risk. And in that, then usually, and actually this has actually been ubiquitously, all the companies that we've looked at have developed pretty good product level understandings of the impacts that they've delivered based off of what they've been able to sell so far, or at least what they've been able to produce in a laboratory setting. That's, I think, because inherently sort of as an Article 9 fund and an impact-oriented fund, these founders are really driven by this environmental objective and looking to build companies because they're trying to solve this specific sustainability challenge. So on the third-party verification thing, pre-investment, what we're looking for there is, have they gone out of their way to basically prove the science of what they're delivering, more than just sort of an Excel model that they've developed sort of as a back of the napkin thing, and looked at like sort of how their product is performing in the field. So an example, like Carbon Cure, one of our companies, they have multiple studies that were published in the late 2010s that were peer reviewed. Those are on their website. We have a couple of companies that have, like Blue Frontier, for example, was spun out of NREL. That's a company that clearly has a decent amount of research that's backed from it. All of this is helping to inform sort of what we're looking at. But then post-investment, we think that there's a lot more capacity for the company to then get a much better idea of sort of what they're delivering. And that's mostly, that is, as of current operations, something that those companies have developed using their own funding. This is not because like we're pushing them to say you need this for 2150, but things like an EPD or like proving the sort of recycled content and therefore the embodied emissions of your battery, for example, this is something that's starting to either be necessary to access new markets or necessary as new policies come online. So that there's not as much of a push that we need to do to say this is just sort of like good hygiene. It's more like, actually, no, the best business decision is to develop this insight because clients and not just investors are asking for that.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Anjali, I see your hand is raised.
I was struck by your point earlier regarding being fossil fuel revenue free. And I was just curious, how do you think about the side of materials, assuming that that may imply that there are some materials in the creation of products that involve fossil fuels? Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So for example, we have one company that uses urea as a small input into one of its things. They're not involved in we would not invest in the company that is taking the natural gas and then processing it into urea and then having that then sold onwards, right? That's actually the refinement of fossil fuel some way. We've identified in that company urea as something that obviously is a key driver of their greenhouse gas emissions of the product and something that we want to take out of it, but they're not specifically exposed to the fossil fuel economy in a way that they are directly profiting off of it. So that's really the main understanding. And so what this is hopefully going to prevent us from it's not only sort of like a pre-investment thing, but what I'm hoping is like as our fund evolves a bit, that this might prevent us from having a company that might try to create a new revenue stream that has sort of that link to the fossil fuel space. That's sort of like a hard stop for us. So we would then have like a very serious discussion of do we potentially divest based off of the fact that you're starting to enter this market that we don't feel that there should be any revenues in our portfolio.
Thank you, Peter. Lots of questions. I'm going to try to pull some of them together. We'll do a twofer since you were talking about connection to fossil fuels. We'll talk about a different area, which is waste incineration. So even though it's considered lower carbon, it is still quite lower carbon compared to coal. It's still very emissions intensive. Do you have any thoughts on that? And then generally, since you look at these different areas that in fact affect the urban stack, what are the new areas that you're looking into doing deep dives around, and are there any subject matters that have you really excited?
Yeah. Oh, I really like the second question because I can get into sort of like beyond CO2 discussion. Yeah. So first on waste incineration, interesting question because I don't necessarily feel like that's a venture capital topic to go after given the scale of these waste incineration facilities, but definitely in my previous work, it's something that we came across at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So I think the easiest answer for this is that when we were looking at waste incineration potentially at EBRD, the thing that really gave us pause is essentially you are locking in a certain amount of trash that has to be burned for the next 30, 40 years. And when you think about how that could prevent the push to more sustainable waste management and sort of like the base load of trash that you might need, it does create certain issues in terms of having that as a sort of serious means of managing that sort of that value stream being the waste. So I would approach waste incineration with a very, very cautious sort of perspective, knowing that it's destruction of value. It certainly has the potential to provide energy, but it really needs to be balanced in a much wider sort of much wider context of what are you going to be doing then in terms of disincentivizing current and future potential waste practices. And then on the deep dive side, there's two that we're developing right now. One is quite advanced, and this is on water. And so this is sort of like where specifically do we think in the urban context would we be able to start addressing issues of water scarcity, particularly given that one stat that we sent out that I showed you earlier before, that 1/3 of cities in the world by 2050 may have severely constrained water supplies. We really think that while agriculture is obviously one of the key users of water globally, cities do play a critical role. And in fact, I think it's like the water, like even though cities are 1.5% of global land area, their watershed coverage is enormous. It's in the, I think it's close to 40%. So then understanding that and sort of what their impact of cities have on reservoirs and water resources is really something that we need to start investing in. Then the other side of things is also on this adaptation side. And this is looking at heat stress and water stress and sort of what are potential profitable angles for us to come in and solutions to start driving adaptation investments and responses. I think as everyone knows, investment in that space is severely lacking. It's going to be one of the discussions at the COP at this year, sort of why is adaptation funding so abysmal. So we really hope, particularly as we're now actually fundraising for a second fund, to have that as a more of a focus and a better presence in terms of how we're expanding our reach.
Thank you so much. I put some other resources for those who are interested in the chat, but that's really interesting. So next, we'll go back to focusing specifically on venture. Since you do invest in earlier stage companies and the environment is often rapidly changing, do you update your impact forecasts as data becomes available? And if so, how often on average?
Absolutely. So that's also a really good question, because I think we see these impact models and forecasts the same way that you should, we would see a financial forecast. like a company's going to have a weird year, or they might have a really good year. And that's all of a sudden going to change what their revenue projections are going to be for the next 5-10 years, right? So we think these impact models should be something that a company is constantly assessing. And if you link it to these sales data, this production data, or sort of these key financial metrics, constantly updating those impact models should be possible. The other side of this is sort of building those like science-based proxies in that says if we're selling one product in this geography, what kind of impact does it have? That's something where as they get better and better data, you can build a more nuanced picture of essentially what is the impact that you're delivering on the ground. So, I mean, there's not really a set timeline for how we review these, but I think it's really just based off of the sort of the information as it becomes available with companies. And then obviously if there are major changes in their business models or projections, then it's something that will affect our impact modeling as well.
Awesome. Do you ever share sort of the forecasts or data internally with the other investors that you're investing with at any point in time?
Oh yeah, well, so I guess the answer is yes and no, because it's not coming from us, it's coming from the companies. What we're trying to do is have those forecasts put in the board reports so that everyone is getting the exact same information who's an investor. So it's not just 2150 sitting on this data set. It's the company that's putting a CO2 model on the slide right after their revenue model.
Awesome, thank you. Did anyone else want to raise their hand so it's not just me asking questions? Otherwise, I have a couple of final talking points on what's coming up in Frame and how to get involved. Going once, going twice. All right, another round of applause for our speakers. I also want to give a special thank you to those at Prime who made this event possible. There is a lot of back and forth and behind the scenes action that happens for these events. So thank you all for that. And then thank you all for attending. If you're interested in an investor profile, please let us know. You can email impact@primecoalition.org. We are hoping to update the format and maybe even include it online. So it's sort of like you can fill out your initial one. Speaking is not required. So we have had investors reach out to just ask if they could look at the profile template to just really help them prompt and think about their own impact strategy. So it can be used as a tool and is nothing that you need to ever share publicly if you do not want to. So if you'd like to learn more, please reach out to us. And as well, like I said, we have focus groups on certain topics. One of them will be additionality. We have upcoming information that we want to discuss regarding relative versus absolute baselines. So if you don't have a ton of time commitment, but want to be involved in the conversation, please reach out and sign up for a focus group. Keep an eye out for our methodology release next week. It is a very big deal and very exciting for our community, and will hopefully really help build best practices and more common terminology moving forward. I think we're adding like 15 terms that we've reached agreement on, so that's really exciting. Thank you everyone for joining. I hope you enjoy your found time. I'll stick on a little bit longer if anyone has any questions for me, but otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day.